Hello, Battleground Bible Church, and welcome to this week's video with our adult Bible study and fellowship in 2 Thessalonians, this week in chapter 2. This is going to be an interesting study. It's a short little book, but it covers some very weighty topics. And if you'll recall, as we began last week in chapter 1, we talked about who's writing this book, to whom, from where is it being written, and about when. We looked for suggestions in the text that would tell us that. We also began to talk about how Paul introduces in chapter 1 with his greeting the main theme or idea that he's going to be discussing. And he introduces this very quickly and kind of gets right to the point because this is such a short epistle, only 3 short chapters. So as you begin preparing this week, I'm going to encourage you again to read through this book in a single sitting at least 2 times prior to Sunday, so that you not only see the content of each chapter, but in particular you see them in the context of the whole. And as we discussed last Sunday, the main idea, the big theme in this is pretty clear, but as we go through our discussion, we'll be looking at all the subpoints and themes that Paul addresses in support of that main idea. And this really helps us to understand the book. And it's interesting to think about this being a letter written to someone as Paul flows through in his thinking and logic through this, all centered around that one key idea. So, as we began our discussion last week, we not only looked at his greeting that is common in all epistles. Remember, he's establishing the pattern in these first 2 epistles that he's ever written. For all the other epistles that he's going to write in the New Testament. He always opens with a greeting, and then he introduces, always in the first chapter, his subject and theme. He may not be directly, but he begins to introduce the theme by opening his letter in greeting to them. Most of them begin with a commendation. I mentioned that last Sunday, but there was one example that I meant to mention. There's one epistle where Paul doesn't open with a commendation, but he instead opens with a condemnation. And I probably wouldn't have to tell you which book that is. I'm going to leave that hanging, and you can ask about that or tell me what that is as we begin our study this coming Sunday. His commendation here was centered around 2 things. He said, boy, I'm really excited to hear that your faith is growing more and more, and that your love for each other, or as he said in the first epistle, your love for the brothers and sisters is increasing. So in other words, everything that I was asking you to do in the first letter I wrote, you're doing. And I'm so excited to hear that. I'm hearing that it's growing and increasing, so much so that we brag about you to all the other churches to whom we speak, whether it's directly or in letters. And he mentions specifically that we brag about how your faith is growing and your love is increasing, especially as you persevere through the persecution and trials that you're experiencing. And that becomes key as he opens this letter and begins to introduce this concept. You'll recall this was a theme of the first epistle as well. He talked to them about the persecution that they were experiencing, how that's normal for Christians. As a matter of fact, he says, we told you before this was going to happen. But as he's writing this second epistle now, we talked about the fact that their persecution in time is becoming more and more severe. They're really struggling. And yet he commends them because in the midst of that, your faith is growing and your love for the brothers and sisters in Christ is growing. And we talk about you to everyone because of that. Now, as he moves on into his introduction, this is where we'll begin our discussion this week, he says these 2 things is evidence of this one thing. And that one thing is that God's judgment is right. Now, that's a very weighty statement in and of itself, but he says this is proof that God's judgment is right, and that therefore, as a result, you are going to be counted worthy of his kingdom. because of all that you're suffering on behalf of the kingdom. He introduced that idea in the first epistle about them being worthy of the kingdom and glory of God. And we said then, boy, that's worthy of some discussion. We'll talk about that more later. Well, here we are in the second epistle, and that same theme is coming up. And he's saying, boy, this is evidence that God's judgment is right and that you are going to be counted worthy of his kingdom. Now, as he moves on in the introduction, he kind of repeats that statement using different words and then expands on that. He says, now, God is just. Remember? Evidence that God's judgment is right, and now he kind of repeats that idea and says, God is just. Because these two things are going to happen, and then as he expands on that, he identifies all the things in support of those two things, which again is stating God is just. So as you prepare for this week, I want you to look at a couple of things. One, there's some basic questions you can ask as you read that to help you identify what those things are that demonstrate that God is just. Ask yourself, what is he expanding, or what's he saying? Identify what it is he's saying that is evidence or proof that God is just. Identify when these things are going to occur, where they're going to occur, and most importantly, why they're going to occur. Now, he brings this introduction, the introduction itself, to a close with an invocation. And we talked about the fact that an invocation is invoking God's blessing on something. We're asking God to bless something, and so the question we have to ask is, what is he asking, and why is he asking that? So between the introduction and the invocation, he is setting the stage for the main idea. And that's where we're going to move in our discussion this week in chapter 2. We said very clearly last week that the main idea is obvious. The main subject is the day of the Lord. And Paul is writing this letter to address that particular thing because there was an error in their thinking here. And it was legitimately so. It wasn't that they were falling away from the faith, but that someone had come and reported, hey, this persecution that you're suffering, in their minds was very clear evidence that the day of the Lord has already happened and you're experiencing the judgment of God. And they were suggesting that Paul had said these things. And Paul says, brothers, I don't want you to be disturbed. I don't want your faith to be shaken because of that. I don't want you to be deceived. He says, you know, that day is not going to happen until two things occur. And he identifies those right in that first paragraph of chapter 2. Those two things have to happen before the day of the Lord comes. And he's saying, don't be disturbed. And he says, even though someone may have told you we said this, it's not true. Not only do I not want you to be disturbed, I don't want you to be deceived. And he then moves on in his discussion of that by saying, that's not going to happen because this has to happen first. And it's interesting that he opens his explanation of this by saying, let me remind you, I shouldn't have to tell you this. You know this already. And he says the reason you should know it is because we talked about it a lot. Wouldn't that be something to have had Paul with you present and have spent so much time talking about not only what it means to be in the faith and to be strong in the faith and to demonstrate your faith to the world around you and to then live in anticipation of Christ's return. And that was so real to them that they felt like not only was it going to happen soon, but now they have this concern that it's happened already. And we're stuck in experiencing God's judgment. He says, not true, because other things are going to happen first. Now, in our discussion last week, I gave you an outline for chapter 1, and on the back of that, as we left the class, I said, as you head into chapter 2, here are some questions for you to ask as you read this, so that you're pulling the facts out from the text and letting the text speak for itself. And then based on the things that you'll discover there, I said, you're going to find some of these topics discussed. Why don't you find some other passages that talk about those same things to help shed light and help our understanding of what Paul is saying here. So, if you weren't in class last week, I'm going to include these questions and these suggestions in the email that has this video link in it. So if you missed class or you weren't able to come because of the weather, don't worry, they're going to be in the email. But I would encourage you to explore those things. And the reason I say that is, as I suggested at the beginning, there's some very weighty topics in this small epistle, and in particular in this chapter 2. And our discussion is going to be better if you're better prepared for that. So I'm going to encourage you to do some study and preparation as we head into our class this coming Sunday, so that not only will our discussion be better, but we'll move through the discussion more quickly. My concern is that there are so many things here, it may take us 2 weeks just to get through this chapter. But even then, all that's going to go quicker, and the discussion is going to be so much better if we're prepared for that. So read the email, look for the questions, and in particular, look for other passages that are going to come and bear weight on that. I hope you find that helpful. And I'm looking forward to our discussion this coming Sunday. I'm looking forward to seeing you there.